He sat alone, 40 feet behind his crew, strapped into a narrow shell of metal and canvas, while the world below blurred into clouds and the cold ate through his gloves. 2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns pointed out into empty sky. The B-17's tail was a thin, vulnerable spear at the rear of a lumbering fortress, and everything depended on the man who manned it. This was Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth, tail gunner, faced with a decision that would not only change the fate of his own crew, but force a rethink of how heavy bombers fought over Europe. The weapon he wielded was not a new gun, not a secret technology. It was a tactic when to pull the trigger. If you want more forgotten stories like this, please like and subscribe. On the morning of July 30th, 1943, at RAF Kimbolton, a grey English dawn settled over the hard stands. Men climbed into a dozen B-17's, engines coughing to life, heated suits humming to fight the 40s and 50s at altitude. Tail gunners checked belts and sights, tucked flak vests tighter, and accepted the peculiar solitude of their post. The tail was, in plain terms, the most exposed place on a bomber. It offered both a view and no shelter. It offered a shot and no backup. Enemy fighters, fast, maneuverable Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, both names appear in period records with variable spellings, indefinido, knew this. German tactics had learned, through experience, how to exploit the doctrine British and American gunners were taught. Wait until the attacker closed to roughly 300 yards, fire short, economical bursts from that range, and save ammunition to the bitter end. That doctrine grew out of a rational calculation. Each of the B-17's Browning guns carried about 400 rounds apiece, roughly 800 rounds for the pair in the tail. Enough, doctrine argued, to meet multiple attacks over a mission if used sparingly. Aircraft channels were narrow. Each tracer token might reveal your position, and wasting rounds on long shots could leave you empty when the decisive moment came. The manual's counsel was conservative by design. A bomber lost was a crew lost. Conserve ammunition, pick your shots. It made the gunners predictable. German pilots, studying bomber behavior, adapted. They began to attack from beyond the doctrinal engagement range, using closure speed and higher approach angles to deliver a firing pass before the tail gunner could get effective fire on them. From 700, 800 yards, they would put the B-17 under a hail of fire that, while less accurate, was repeated and demoralizing. In practice, the prescribed wait and conserve approach allowed attacking fighters to set up effective runs with less risk to themselves. Doctrine had been written in classrooms and training fields. Combat wrote a different lesson. Michael Aruth did not accept that answer. He was a believer in the calculus of disruption, that an aggressive, early defense could fracture the geometry of an attack, force enemy pilots to overshoot or break formation, and buy a precious, immediate margin of safety for the bomber. He had seen it before in smaller engagements, and he trusted his eyes and the gun camera to tell him whether the gamble worked. The early experiment that would mark the beginning of his reputation came during a raid on the French Atlantic coast in June of 1943. Targets around Saint-Nazaire were typical objectives at the time. On that mission, according to unit records and later memoirs by members of the crew, Aruth opened up at ranges far beyond the doctrinal 300 yards, 700 to 800 yards, by the accounts that survive. Tracers arced through the high air and forced attackers to alter their approach. One fighter overshot, another peeled away to avoid the incoming hail. In the cramped tail, Aruth felt the recoil digging through his shoulders, but saw, through the narrow aperture, that the offensive geometry had changed. The fighters were no longer lining up clean runs. The bomber returned, dented but flying. For a man whose job was to keep that aircraft whole until it reached home, that small break in the enemy's rhythm was everything. Aruth's approach was straightforward and dangerous. Extend the engagement envelope, trade ammunition for disruption, use the first seconds of contact to impose uncertainty on the attacker. His critics, within some circles of gunnery instructors, called it wasteful. His supporters increasingly would call it vital. The structure of the tail gun station amplified his choices. The B-17's tail position offered two 50-cal Browning machine guns mounted on a ring, belts of ammunition feeding from drums, and an observer's hatch giving a crude but wide field of fire. Visibility was limited, the guns were cold metal in a colder airstream, and the heated suits were barely adequate. At 25,000 feet, breath fogged the plexiglass, instruments clicked. Outside, the world was thin and bright and hostile. The tail felt, to those who sat in it, like a thinly defended watchtower placed at the far edge of a fortress. July 30th, 1943, was supposed to be another of the long-range raids that characterized the summer campaign. The target, noted in mission orders of the 379th Bombardment Group, was a facility code-named Castle in the briefing documents. Operational maps indicate a strike deeper into occupied Europe, where fighter opposition had been increasing in frequency and ferocity. The 379th climbed in box formations, relying on mutual fields of fire, navigational discipline, and long escort ranges that, at this point in the summer, were still insufficient for the deepest penetrations. They flew with the knowledge that the Luftwaffe had been sharpening its tactics. The combination of German single-engine fighters and their hit-and-run passes across the bomber stream made each mission a calculus of timing and exposure. For men like Aruth, that calculus sharpened into a minute-by-minute choice: conserve for the imagined decisive run, or throw everything available into the earliest opportunity to disrupt the enemy. On that July morning, almost immediately after they cleared the Channel and the North Sea skies, the escort windows grew thin. Fighters streaked toward the formation in waves, some scouting to determine weak points, some making attack runs. Reports from the mission show that German fighters approached from unexpected arcs, testing the defensive cohesion of the bomber boxes. The enemy pilots deployed tactics designed to minimize exposure: slashing passes from oblique angles, high-speed dives that turned into shallow firing runs. Aruth saw a quartet of fighters slip under the cloud deck and climb to intercept. He made a decision at a range that would have, under manual doctrine, been judged premature. At 700 to 800 yards, he opened up. The tail guns barked, tracers stitched a line across the sky. For a moment, shooting at that distance felt like firing into a pale, indistinct horizon. But the tracers told a true story. The fighters altered course, jinked from their intent, and two of them reeled away in a pattern that denied them the clean firing angle they had sought. Throughout the engagement, ammunition sloughed away in belts. Aruth's log for the mission lists numerous bursts, short, measured, and sometimes longer when attackers held a firing run. He expended hundreds of rounds. The record that accompanies his later recognition shows a pattern of heavy use. The 400 rounds per gun the aircraft carried were pressed into service, and on this July mission he burned deeply into that supply. By some accounts, his guns had relatively small quantities left by the time they returned. Details vary in the surviving documents, but are consistent in their direction. He used what he had to make the attacking fighters lose their nerve. The result was not spectacular in the sense of dramatic single-pass dogfights. It was incremental. One fighter forced high, another broke off to attempt a flanking run, and was met by escort interceptors. The bomber's tail received glancing blows, but nothing fatal. The B-17, the aircraft that later sources would associate with Aruth under the name Tandelo, spelled in operational notes also as Tandleo, indefinido, came home with bodies in its bunks and holes in its skin, but with its crew intact. That return, under a hail of fragmentary reports and the obscured calculus of battle, carried a simple moral that would come to define Aruth's method. Disruption at distance had tangible value. The human element of those hours cannot be reduced to numbers. The tail gunner works in isolation and in concert. Isolation in the sense of physical separation, concert in the sense of mutual dependence. The pilot and co-pilot do not see what the tailman sees. The waist gunners cannot reach back into the space where the tail sits. Decisions made by a single man could, in the span of a few seconds, alter the geometry of an attack and change the fate of the entire crew. Aruth understood this. He was not the only gunner to test the rulebook in the early months of the air war, but he was among those whose choices left a trace in official records. By the end of July, Aruth's patrols had accumulated a sequence of engagements that, when stitched together, suggested a pattern. The more aggressively the tail guns were used at extended ranges, the more likely attacking fighters were to break off or to be forced into less advantageous approaches. Gun camera footage, where it existed, provided corroboration. Film from the tail stations, grainy and inchoate, showed traces and enemy silhouettes and times when an early burst forced fighters to jink. Analysts would later point to these films as the first objective evidence that the long-range engagement tactic worked in many instances. Yet the cost was visible too. The strain on a gunner's body from sustained firing at altitude, the bitter cold that turned fingers numb in an instant, and the psychological toll of watching enemy planes arrive and then either be repelled or succeed, made the job brutally exacting. Aruth, by the time he left those missions, carried not only physical scars, but the weight of decisions that had exposed his crew to a revised equation of risk and safety. He believed the trade-off was worth it. His squadron mates began, quietly and in the tail-to-tail language of crews, to adopt similar habits, a burst at longer range, a willingness to use more of the drums early, a belief that making the first move could unsettle an attacker's plan. One engagement in particular in late July crystallized this movement from individual tinkering to tactical pattern. On July 30th, the formation encountered a concentrated fighter effort aimed not just at one bomber, but at the lead elements of the group. In the heat of those minutes, multiple crews reported fighters broken off after coming under fire from unexpected quarters. A number of bombers in the formation received hits, some beyond repair, but several others, Tandalo among them, were able to keep flying and to withdraw. Aruth's gunnery logs from that mission and the after-action reports provide specific metrics: belts spent, bursts fired, and targets engaged. Those figures would later feed into a larger analysis by group commanders concerned with survivability statistics. For Aruth, the July missions were not merely about immediate survival. They were field experiments under the most uncompromising of conditions. He kept track of rounds fired and of observed effects. When a fighter overshot and went into a spin, he noted it. When another took tracer fire and broke its approach, he recorded it. This record-keeping would prove crucial. It is one thing for a gunner to do something different. It is another for that action to be seen, measured, and argued into change. That argument reached beyond the flight deck. Elmer Bendiner, Tandelo's navigator and later memoirist, would write about these sorties in a way that preserved the texture of a crew learning as it flew. Bendiner's recollections, paired with mission reports, gave higher headquarters a narrative to follow. Here were instances where early, aggressive tailgun fire coincided with fewer catastrophic losses in certain engagements. The 379th Bombardment Group plotted losses and returns and noticed an emerging correlation. Gun camera evidence began to be assembled and compared against loss reports. The idea of disrupting enemy attack geometry is, in essence, an idea about timing. A German fighter aiming for a clean shot requires time and position to produce a lethal run. That time is a commodity. If a defender can force a pilot to spend that commodity in evasive moves, or to abort a pass altogether, the defender increases the bomber's chances of survival. The doctrinal counsel to conserve ammunition, assumed that a conservative expenditure of rounds would ultimately lead to better outcomes across a mission. Aruth's alternative assumed that buying immediate disruption could prevent the decisive run, and thus reduce the likelihood of catastrophic hits in the first place. Tactically, the benefits are straightforward to imagine and maddeningly difficult to quantify. Closure rates at the speeds involved, fighters in high-speed dives, B-17's in steady descent or level flight, meant that a pilot had only seconds to close to effective firing range. Fire early, and you take a long, uncertain shot. Fire late, and you may not be able to prevent a clean strike. Aruth's tactic aimed at widening that small window in the bomber's favor by removing the attacker's confidence. It was adversarial chess played at 500 miles per hour. The July 30th mission was not over without consequence. Within the formation, some aircraft took heavy damage and were lost, ordinary in the calculus of deep penetration raids of mid-1943. Tandello emerged badly shorn of skin and with members of its crew wounded. Aruth himself suffered injuries, wounds listed in the records as non-fatal, but serious enough to be medically noted. The October and November awards lists would later enumerate decorations and recognize bravery, the Distinguished Service Cross among them, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Purple Heart for wounds, and multiple air medals for sustained combat service. Those honors, however, came after the facts and did not change the immediate condition. A crew that returned, a man who had used most of his ammunition, and a tactic that was beginning to be murmured about in the corridors of command. As the summer drew on, the pattern repeated in small and large ways across missions. Mid-August sorties recorded similar instances of extended-range engagement by tail gunners in the 379th and adjacent groups. Gun camera footage was scoured for evidence, where traces or bursts were visible and where a fighter's approach vector altered in response. Analysts logged the event. The 379th collected these films and cross-referenced them with loss return sheets and witness statements. The pattern, preliminary and not absolute, was there. When tail gunners fired early and decisively, a number of attacking runs failed to result in crippling hits on bombers. Word spread informally at first. Gunners compare notes in crew rooms and over a pint. They teach one another the smallest tricks of their craft. The culture of bomber crews, steeped in mutual reliance, encouraged the adoption of practical habits that worked. It did not always fit neatly with doctrine. Commanders and doctrinal officers are cautious by training. They fear unintended consequences, wasted ammunition, increased detection, and the chance that a new habit will amplify rather than reduce losses. Yet data began to push the question up the chain. If gun camera evidence and unit statistics suggested a survivability advantage, should doctrine be amended? The question arrived at the desk of 8th Air Force analysts. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson appears in multiple later reviews as a reviewer of the analytic work, his name attached to a period of closer scrutiny of anti-fighter tactics. Records show his involvement. More precise attribution of his comments may vary. Indefinido. Analysts compared return rates for bomber boxes where extended range firing had been used with those where more conservative firing was recorded. They looked at the number of fighters engaged, the time of day, escort availability, and other variables that might confound a simple cause-effect story. The preliminary conclusion was cautious. In many instances, extended-range tail gun engagement correlated with a reduction in effective enemy firing runs and, by extension, a lowered incidence of crippling hits. Correlation, as always, was not proof of causation, but it commanded attention. That attention would reach a formal point of decision in the months ahead. By November, doctrinal guidance within 8th Air Force would be revised to permit, under certain conditions, an extended-range engagement philosophy. The revision did not proclaim a universal rule. It offered commanders discretionary latitude to authorize broader firing envelopes in contexts where the evidence suggested it would increase survivability. The policy change was an institutional acknowledgement that tactics learned in the field could and should inform doctrine when the evidence supported it. For men like Aruth, this administrative change would represent official validation of a practice that had been until then a matter of gut and experience. But that validation had not yet arrived in full by the end of that summer. The scramble of combat, missions, returns, repairs, debriefs, carried on. Crews continued to argue over technique, to swap ammunition when possible, to read gun camera film over and over. And as the air war intensified, the stakes rose. By early September, missions grew deeper and more hazardous. Fighter opposition became more coordinated. On September 6, 1943, a raid on a heavy industrial target in the Stuttgart area drew concentrated German response. The day would come to be one of the most costly in the bomber campaigns of that phase, a trial in which tactics, courage, and the limits of machines and men all came under severe pressure. Before that storm, however, the narratives of men like Aruth were still being formed in the small skirmishes of July and August. The work he did in the tail, firing early, pressing the attack, recording outcomes, began to tip the balance in isolated engagements. When a fighter failed to complete its run because of unexpected traces, that fighter's potential damage to the bomber stream was averted. Multiply those avoided hits across missions, and the human cost begins to look, in aggregation, meaningful. Aruth's tally, as recorded across mission reports and later consolidated by unit historians, would come to an extraordinary total: 17 enemy aircraft destroyed, attributed to his gunnery over the course of his combat tenure. That number, 17 confirmed, would become the headline attached to his record. It's a number that invites bold statements, that a single tail gunner shot down 17 attackers and changed the air war. But such claims must be measured against the reality of war. Confirmation comes from cross-checking gun camera footage, witness statements and loss reports. Attribution is complex. The broader effect on enemy operations was the result of many factors: improved escort, evolving fighter strategies, the bravery of many gunners. Still, 17 confirmed kills is a stark and indisputable indicator of effectiveness at the tactical level, and it is part of why Aruth's name appears in both unit logs and later memorials. The physical cost of those engagements was not small. Wounds accumulated. For Aruth, the list of injuries included shrapnel and bruising, events that would earn him a Purple Heart and necessitate periods of convalescence. He remained in service after the war, continuing in the Air Force until 1962, an institutional journey that carried the practical memory of combat into peacetime service. The decorations he received, the Distinguished Service Cross among them, the Distinguished Flying Cross, multiple air medals, recognized both singular bravery and sustained performance. Within the 379th, the practice of earlier engagement began to be taught informally. Gunners who had seen it work passed the technique down, carefully balancing the threat of wasting precious rounds with the reward of breaking an attack's rhythm. Gun camera evidence provided a technical validation that could be shown to skeptical instructors. "Look," the film said, "here is where early fire forced the attacker to jink. Here is where a pass was aborted. Here is where a bomber's skin remained intact because an enemy approach was compromised." That evidence changed minds slowly but surely. Yet for all the analytic work and the mounting numbers, each mission remained an act of improvisation. On a bomber, doctrine and innovation existed in a constant, uneasy conversation. The manual told a cautious tale, the man in the tail, with a unique vantage, and the live evidence of every run, sometimes drew different conclusions. For Michael Aruth and men like him, that tension between theory and fieldcraft was more than an intellectual exercise. It was a daily negotiation with life and death. The story that began to be told in mess halls and debrief rooms, filmed in gun movies and recorded in mission logs, would eventually attract formal scrutiny. 8th Air Force analysts would compile statistics, compare gun camera evidence with loss tables, and slowly build a case that policy could accommodate more aggressive tail engagement in the right circumstances. The November doctrinal revision would not be a proclamation of victory, but a cautious adoption, an opening in doctrine to allow tail gunners more latitude when conditions warranted. But before that institutional acceptance, the war continued to test crews. The missions of August and the catastrophic raid on September 6th would bring that test into the open. Tandelo, Tandleo in variant records, a difference that must be treated as uncertain, indefinido, would be among the ships pressed into the heart of that day's fighting. The story of August and the early weeks of September is a story of escalation, more fighters, better coordination, and a sky in which the calculus of survival became ever more acute. It is here, at the hinge between adaptation and recognition, that Aruth's choices become most consequential. On missions following July 30th, his practice of extended range engagement continued, sometimes rewarded, sometimes punished by the capriciousness of combat. The cumulative effect of his gunnery was both tactical and symbolic. Tactical in the sense that individual attacks were disrupted and lives, on some days, saved. Symbolic in that his behavior embodied a principle of frontline innovation, that the man closest to the danger, who faces it minute by minute, sometimes knows the best answer for that moment, even if the manual still says otherwise. In the tale, Aruth learned to read more than the arc of a tracer. He read the pause in an attacker's throttle, the slight change in approach that suggested a pilot was lining up a shot. He developed a feel for when to trade rounds for disruption. The results were recorded in film and in human memory. A gun camera frame might show the shadow of a fighter, the sear of a burst, and a figure yawing away. A crew's log might list 3 hits taken elsewhere in the formation and a return home, with wounded but surviving men. These fragments combined into a narrative that would later be stitched into doctrine. And yet, even as gun camera film began to paint a picture, the skeptics remained. Commanders rightly demanded comprehensive analysis. What were the long-term costs of higher ammunition expenditure? Did an early burst draw fighters away from one bomber only to send them toward another? Was a short-term protective effect merely redistribution? These were not rhetorical questions. They were operational variables that required numerical assessment. When the 379th presented their data, and when Brigadier General Anderson and his analytics staff reviewed it, the conclusion was modest but significant. Extended-range tailgun engagement, in a number of documented cases, coincided with disrupted enemy runs and reduced immediate losses. The evidence was not universal, and its interpretation required context. But the momentum of field practice and film evidence was undeniable. That momentum would carry the idea into formal consideration and eventually into policy. For Aruth, the debates and the data were less important than the next mission. He returned to the tale again and again. He noted the feel of the guns and the cloud patterns, the direction of the sun and the way tracers looked against a certain kind of sky. He kept firing. His tally climbed towards 17 confirmed kills. The number grew in the official reports and found its way into the pages of unit histories and into the memories of those who had flown with him. It became a shorthand for effectiveness, a single tail gunner who had made a measurable impact in the air war. As the late summer wore into September, the air campaign intensified, and tests of both doctrine and adaptation multiplied. Tandelo's next major test, where damage, ditching, and crew survival would intersect, was approaching. The machine of war, ever indifferent to individual valor, was about to make the question of tactical innovation painfully concrete. The evidence that had been accumulating in July and August would face its severest scrutiny yet. Not in a statistics meeting, but in a sky full of enemy fighters where split-second choices decided outcomes. The machine of war did not wait for arguments. It demanded answers in the air. On September 6, 1943, those answers came under fire. The mission that day, deep into enemy territory, aimed at heavy industrial targets around Stuttgart, the spelling of some records varies, indefinido, was one of the fiercest of that phase of the campaign. Fighter opposition was heavy, coordinated, and relentless. Escorts were strained. Bomb boxes bled fighters and aircraft alike. Tandelo, also written in some logs as Tandleo indefinido, found itself in the middle of a maelstrom. Tandelo had been loaded with more ammunition than on a typical sortie. By the mission logs carried forward into unit histories, the aircraft left Kimballton with roughly 1,200 rounds allocated for its tail guns. That extra load was a tacit recognition of the hazard of deep penetration without reliable long-range escort. For Aruth, it meant he could press the envelopes he'd been testing all summer with a slightly larger margin. He would need it. From the tail, the sky that morning was a hard, metallic blue, streaked with contrails, and the dark silhouettes of fighters. The lead box was a bright target. Fighters struck in waves, first probing, then full attack. They came from altitudes above and below, from the sun, from the cloud edges. The air filled with the sound of engines and the staccato rattle of guns. Guns across the formation answered in a chaotic chorus. In the cramped, vibrating space of the tail, Aruth saw arcs and shadows and had to decide, again and again, when to fire. He fired early. He fired often. The tactic he'd refined, opening at extended ranges to make the first move, was in full effect. Tracers stitched the air, and in many moments the effect was exactly what reports had suggested. Attackers aborted their runs, overshot, jinked, or broke formation. In other moments, the Luftwaffe pilots persisted, trading long slants of fire with the desperate defense of the bomber boxes. Tandelo did not escape unscathed. Enemy cannon and machine guns found the fuselage and control surfaces. Reports from the ditching and the later debrief describe severe structural damage. Hydraulic lines hit, an engine ablaze or marginal. Exact technical terms in the flight log vary, and some designations are marked indefinido. And critically, progressive loss of control that made returning to England impossible. The crew fought to keep the ship aloft, to maintain formation where they could, but the aircraft's condition deteriorated. At a point where ditching became the only option, the crew executed the emergency procedures honed in training and fear. They abandoned the stricken bomber into life rafts. The channel was cold, the sea unforgiving. Yet the training worked. Rescue units, coastal vessels and aircraft tasked with search and retrieval moved to the area. Tandelo's crew survived. The accounts that followed speak of frostbitten faces, of men huddled together on canvas, of a kind of exhausted quiet that follows an instant of violence. Aruth was among them. He had been wounded in the mission, wounds recorded in the medical notes as non-fatal, but serious enough to be documented and later to earn a Purple Heart. The record is discreet about precise details. The important fact is that his injuries did not end his ability to tell what he had seen. He could and did point to hours of film, to belt counts, to the difference early fire made when fighters had to alter their plans under unexpected traces. When Tandelo ditched, mission reports and later unit reviews cross-reference gun camera film captured that day with witness testimony and enemy loss sheets. Today, the language is careful, because wartime claims and battlefield chaos complicate certainty. Still, the aggregated evidence was revealing. In multiple instances that day, extended-range tailgun fire coincided with broken enemy runs and with fighters failing to deliver decisive strikes on bombers. In others, it only delayed the inevitable. The human calculus of those moments resists neat summation. For every bomber saved, there were others lost. For every attacker forced away by tracers, there might be one that completed its run on a different target in the formation. Analysts were careful to weigh these variables, yet for the men in the raft, Aruth among them, the question was not statistical nuance in the moment. It was survival. After recovery and medical care, Aruth returned to the 379th's debriefing rooms and to the slow, bureaucratic work of turning combat experience into institutional knowledge. He and his crewmates provided statements. Elmer Bendiner, Tandelo's navigator and an important chronicler of the unit's missions, contributed his own recollections, preserving the texture of the crew's choices and the small decisions that mattered. Those recollections, written down and cross-checked against film, provided the raw material analysts needed. 8th Air Force analysts took up that material. Their work was painstaking. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson's name appears in subsequent analytic reviews as a figure involved in the scrutiny. Precise attributions and the wording of his comments in some documents are indefinido, but the existence of a higher-level review is clear. Analysts compared return and loss rates across boxes and over time. They catalogued where gun camera frames showed tracers intersecting fighter approach vectors and where pilots in those frames subsequently jinked or overshot. They logged belt expenditures from gunnery reports, how many rounds were used on particular missions, the duration of bursts, and where available, the residual ammunition counted at the end of runs. Those residual counts sometimes tell a stark tale. On several missions, reports recorded tail guns, starting with approximately 100 to 200 rounds in total and ending with only small pockets of ammunition remaining. On one mission, the numbers show as few as 63 rounds left in the drums at recovery. Such figures were used by skeptics to argue the tactics cost. They were used by supporters to demonstrate that the calculated expenditure could be justified by the defensive effect. The numbers did not, on their own, settle the debate. Contextual analysis did. Statistical review showed a pattern that merited attention. In a number of documented engagements, where extended-range tailgun fire was recorded, the incidence of successful, crippling fighter hits on bombers declined relative to comparable missions, where conservative firing was the norm. Analysts were careful to account for confounding factors: escort presence, weather, target type, time in mission, the concentration of enemy fighters. But even with those caveats, the correlation persisted in the data set examined. The 8th Air Force did not claim that the tactic was a universal remedy. Instead, it recognized that in certain tactical contexts, deep penetration missions, with thin escort and concentrated fighter opposition, authorizing tailgunners greater latitude to engage at longer ranges might increase survivability. That recognition culminated in a doctrinal revision issued in November of 1943. The revision was modestly worded. It did not overturn the logic of ammunition conservation in every circumstance. It granted commanders discretion to permit extended-range engagement where unit analysis and mission conditions made it sensible. It was, crucially, an institutional acknowledgement that field practice backed by film and numbers deserved doctrinal accommodation. For Aruth and the gunners, who had quietly tested the manual's boundaries, it was a formal validation that the tactics they had risked could save lives. The change did not spark a dramatic, immediate shift in the air war. It provided a framework under which training and gunnery instruction could incorporate lessons from practice. Tail gunnery courses began to include, in controlled fashion, scenarios where earlier engagement might be appropriate. Gun camera analysis continued to be used to study runs and to refine recommendations. The cultural effect, crew-to-crew transmission of methods, the telling of what worked in mess halls and debriefs, persisted and was now backed by policy. Aruth's personal tally reached the figure that would anchor his legacy: 17 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed over the course of his combat tours. That number found its way into awards boards, to unit histories, and into post-war recollections. Confirmation required cross-referencing film, witness testimony, and enemy losses recorded in intelligence reports. Where attribution was murky, analysts marked it carefully. Where confirmation met standards, the tallies were entered into the official record. 17 confirmed kills is a striking statistic. It is evidence of tactical effectiveness at the level of individual action. It is also an index of the intensity of the air war. The number bears witness to countless hours of patrol, to repeated proximity to danger, and to the particular vantage of the tail gunner. Aruth's decorations followed the arc of his record. The Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest recognitions for extraordinary heroism in combat, appears in the honours lists associated with his service. So do the Distinguished Flying Cross and multiple air medals for consistent meritorious combat operations. The Purple Heart marks the wounds he suffered in the line of duty. These awards recognize courage and performance, yet they do not capture the quieter measures of consequence. The men who slept another night because a tail gunner forced an attacker to abort. The families who were spared grief for one more mission. After the war, Aruth remained in uniform. He served in the U.S. Air Force until 1962, bringing the experience and lessons of aerial combat into a peacetime institution that would face new challenges in a changing world. His wartime record, film reels, mission logs, debrief notes, found a place in archives, the institutional memory preserved in the collections associated with the 8th Air Force, and repositories that care for the material history of air campaigns. References to specific archival holdings vary across inventories, indefinido. Historians and curators have used these records to reconstruct the lived reality of bomber crews and to analyze how small, field-level choices can ripple into doctrine. The tactical lesson embedded in Aruth's story was not a doctrine of recklessness. It was an argument for empiricism in combat decision-making. Test, observe, document, analyze. It was an argument for humility in headquarters. Listen to those who have the vantage of danger. It was an argument about the nature of adaptation when lives are on the line. The hidden weapon, the title points to, was simply the human capacity to reevaluate and act under pressure, an adaptive tactic disguised not by technology, but by timing. Those who study air operations pull many threads from this history. They note the limits. Not every early burst produced success. Not every belt expended was justified. Not every fighter driven away meant another bomber survived. They also note the structural consequence. Gun camera technology gave commanders a new kind of evidence, making tactical debate less anecdotal and more empirical. That shift between hearsay and filmed fact altered how doctrine could be argued and changed the pace at which new practices could be adopted. For Aruth, the end of combat did not dissolve the quiet part of the story, the long social life of memory. Crews who had flown with him carried his example into reunions, memoirs, and the oral histories collected by veteran organizations. Elmer Bendina's recollections ensured that Tandelo's story was not reduced to statistics. Bendina preserved the texture of a crew's life in which the tailman's choices mattered every day. These memories, combined with the formal records, produced a fuller picture of bravery and calculation, of damage and rescue, of policy and practice. The reckoning with cost remains essential. Men were wounded and killed. Ships were lost. Aruth himself bore scars. The narrative does not allow us to forget that behind every tactical innovation are human bodies. The doctrine change in November 1943 acknowledged that truth, policy could be amended to reduce risk, not erase it. In the decades that followed, the story of the B-17 tail gunner remained emblematic of a certain kind of wartime courage, solitary, technical, decisive. The tail gunner sat apart and watched the sky, carrying the terrible calculus of when to let the enemy get closer and when to use what had been allotted to push them back. For Aruth, that calculus led to a career marked by extraordinary action and, in the record, by 17 verified enemy aircraft destroyed. For the Air Force, it produced a modest but meaningful doctrinal shift and a reminder that learning in war often proceeds from austere experiments at the sharp edge of danger. When historians examine the archive, gun camera reels, after-action reports, personnel files, they find a complicated mosaic. There are clear instances where early aggressive tail gun fire changed the geometry of an attack. There are also cases that resist such tidy attribution. The disciplined conclusion is consistent with how the 8th Air Force framed it. Field innovation, documented and analyzed, can and should inform doctrine, but with an awareness of trade-offs and the need for careful oversight. Michael Aruth's military record closes the wartime chapter, but the memorials remain. Unit histories, award citations, and archival holdings preserve his story for later generations. Museums, including those focused on the 8th Air Force's history, specific holdings and catalogue entries vary, indefinido, hold artifacts and records that contextualize the experience. A Browning, .50 caliber belt here, a pilot's logbook there, a grainy gun camera reel that, when cued, still shows the moment a tracer line makes an enemy pilot hesitate. These objects are quiet witnesses to the very loud choices made at 25,000 feet. The lesson is not merely technical. It is moral and organizational. It speaks to the way institutions balance caution and initiative, to the burdens placed on individuals who are asked to act when doctrine offers no perfect answer. It tells us that sometimes a change in when you pull the trigger makes all the difference between a return and a burial detail. It tells us that evidence matters, that gun camera film can turn conversation into policy. It tells us that bravery, when combined with observable results and rigorous analysis, can reshape how a force fights. When we look back at the B-17's history and at the men who manned its positions, we should remember both the human and the procedural lessons. Remember the loneliness of the tale. Remember the cold and the constant vigilance. Remember that tactical innovation often begins with the quiet refusal of a single operator to accept a textbook answer when reality tells a different story. Remember that those refusals can lead to institutional shifts that save lives, even as they exact a cost. Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth did not have a new weapon in his hands. He had a pair of Browning .50s, cold air, a heated suit, and a willingness to alter the timing of defense. That willingness, recorded in film, corroborated by men like Elmer Bendener, and analyzed by 8th Air Force staff under Brigadier General Frederick Anderson's oversight, contributed to a tactical conversation that changed doctrine. 17 confirmed kills stand as a quantifiable measure of his impact. The November 1943 revision stands as the institutional echo of a practice proven in combat. These are not stories of unambiguous triumph. They are stories of adaptation, measurement, and the heavy price of war. They are stories about men who sat at the edge of a fortress and made decisions that mattered. They are also a reminder that policy should listen to the people who execute it under fire, and that evidence, when gathered and respected, can turn improvisations into doctrines that better preserve life. If this account moved you, share this to remember these crews. Subscribe to keep these stories alive.